People have been asking for some ride footage in my Cedar Strip wah cloned Velomobile. This is not my first ride by any means, but it's first ride when I finally remembered to mount a camera and actually record some playback. This is a ride that's taking place in one of the suburbs of Minneapolis, just a fairly recent ride, and it's just a little 16-mile out and back loop along the river bluffs in Bloomington, Minnesota. And here I'm just waiting on one of the local streets for traffic to clear. I've been working on finding a somewhat flatter route to ride that will allow me to avoid as many stoplights and stop signs as possible, but being in an inner suburb of a city, that is pretty challenging. There's a little bit of a slight downward gradient, as you can see. The Garmin Verb app is marking this as about -2%. And that might be a little bit on the generous side, but it's enough downhill gradient that you can get going pretty quickly at a fast speed. It's really remarkable how quickly a Velomobile picks up speed when you have even just a slight downhill gradient. The quality of the pavement here in the Minneapolis area is not particularly high, so it can be a fairly bumpy, kind of clunky sort of riding experience in the Velomobile. Every time you hit a bump, you worry that something's going to crack, but fortunately fiberglass has some give to it. I'm not sure whether carbon fiber or fiberglass would make any difference as far as how well it handles these kind of rough pavements. This bit of trail here runs along France Avenue most of the way down to the river bluffs, but there's a little bit of an uphill, and I found sort of a workaround that's a little bit flatter and actually quite a bit more scenic that just passes through this bit of a residential area. I've also been working on seeing just what the limit is for cornering before I start to lift a wheel, and for me, somewhere around 15 miles an hour is about as fast as I want to push it right now, going around curves until I have a few more rides and have a better feel for how the Velomobile handles. This bit of road passes by a little bit of a pond swamp area that's part of the watershed for 9 Mile Creek that runs kind of across the south side of the inner ring of the suburbs here. It's one of my favorite stretches of road, actually. There's very rarely any traffic. The pavement's passable, and it's a fairly nice little scenic area. So you can see again, it's a little bit of a downhill gradient, and without even pushing that hard, you can get up into the lower 20s pretty easily. Speed limit, of course, is 25 miles an hour along there, so probably don't want to push it too far. The shoulder area here is considered a designated bike lane, and there's this bike lane that runs across from roughly Normandale Avenue quite a ways towards, I think Penn Avenue is maybe where it ends. It actually may continue on a little bit beyond that, but I don't generally ride along 90th. I'm going to hang a right here, and I'm back onto that section of trail that I was on just a moment before I took that little scenic detour. This bit of trail is new within the last couple of years. It used to be that the trail ended here and you would have to ride along France Avenue, but there was only shoulder here on the southbound side. So if you're going northbound, it was kind of awkward because you felt like you were riding against traffic, and I'm not sure if that was actually legal at that point in time or not, but I certainly wasn't going to mix it up with traffic. And there's another trail just a little bit to the west of here, but it's got quite a bit of a steep hill at the end of it. Sure, it'd be fun to take the Velomobile down going south, but heading north it would be a bit of a grind getting up. This area is obviously quite clunky to ride on too, but it sure beats riding along the road, and it's really the only way along here to get south that doesn't involve going steeply uphill. Minnesota, of course, has a reputation as being relatively flat, but once you get down along the river this close to the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers, it's surprisingly lumpy. Car drivers have a tendency to pull up way too much. This is when having a horn on your Velomobile comes in handy, because usually it's loud enough that drivers, unless they're blasting their music, can at least hear that, you know, you're trying to get their attention. The other good thing with a Velomobile is once you get a good head of steam going, you can carry it uphill with fairly minimal loss of mile-per-hour speed. We're just passing Normandale College here, local community college. And then when we get up to the stoplight, we're going to hang a left, and I found a slightly flatter bypass. The bike trail continues here straight, but there's a couple of small uphill climbs that'll slow things down to 5, 6, 7 miles per hour if I'm really pushing it. Why suffer through that kind of speed loss when you can just cross over a few streets and find a flatter route? There's also 2 or 3 stoplights beyond this that kind of put a stop to progress as well. It's a little bit of an awkward crossing here because the turning radius would make it tough to clear there on the actual dedicated pedestrian crosswalk. There's no dedicated bike lane across here, but aside from that car there, they do have 2 lanes each way, and I don't feel quite so bad about blocking traffic when they've got extra lanes to go around. Plus, I'm not that much below the speed limit here. I think it's maybe 30 miles an hour, so I don't feel like I'm holding up large amounts of traffic by a significant margin. To the left of the screen is the Bloomington Ice Arena. I'm assuming that's for skating and hockey and stuff. I've never actually bothered to go in there. You would think that perfectly flat roads would be the ideal place to ride a velomobile, but I've actually found that having just a little bit of gentle gradient actually is more fun. You get those little bit of downhill bits, even 1 or 2% is enough to get you a really good speed, and then you can carry that up into the next little bit of uphill. This is Xerxes Avenue, which has a nice wide shoulder going both directions. Unfortunately, it doesn't run continuous north to south. There's some wetlands and things like the ice arena and stuff that kind of get in the way of the street, so you kind of have to work around it a little bit. The pavement's certainly not perfect along here either, but there are amazingly streets that are substantially worse than this. Some of the clunk 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 that you're hearing is just because the suspension is, a little bit clunky, but it's also just the chain rattling in the chain tunnel. And you'd think, okay, make a deeper chain tunnel, but on the power side of the chain line, there are 2 idlers, and there's a little metal piece that kind of sits sort of just above the floor and keeps things from tipping around or something. And if the chain tunnel is too deep, that metal piece will flip around, and that wouldn't work out so well. So the chain just kind of has a tendency to rattle against there, and it gets kind of old after a while, but it's not as frustrating as running into a stop sign like that, like the one that I just went through, and then having to regain all of your momentum. And as you can see on the gradient profile at the bottom of the screen, now I get to try to rebuild my momentum while going uphill. And even though the gradient here is maybe 1 or 2% or something, it still really takes a bit to get going again. And that's one of the reasons that having a velomobile in the city isn't quite as efficient a way of getting around as you would think, because there's so much stopping and starting. And people talk about using velomobiles as an alternative form of transportation in a city, but when you've got a heavier velomobile like mine that runs around 85 pounds, before you put me and all of my stuff in it, it really does take a while to get back up to speed. There are some times when certain routes I can ride on my Vachetta Giro 20, I almost average just as fast on those routes as I do in the velomobile, and there's maybe a 1 mile an hour difference because there's so much stop and start, or there's so many hills. And the route that I often ride the most, which passes around East and West Bush Lake, because of the placement of the stop signs and the gradient of the hills, I just don't ride in that area in the velomobile, because there's just no fun, especially in warmer weather, sitting in a velomobile and going 3 miles an hour uphill while you're sitting in a steamy hot velomobile. Even with the race hood off, which I normally don't ride that way just because it's more aerodynamic with it on, but even with it off, when the weather's warmer, it gets really, really steamy in the velomobile, and you end up sitting in a puddle of water literally on the floor of the velomobile. This section of road's a nice long stretch with a fairly favorable gradient here. And as you can see from my speed, I've gotten back up to a good full speed here. there are an awful lot of expansion cracks in the road. Kind of the nature of, again, riding in a northern climate. I do want to do another roll down test on the Velomobile because I feel lately like I've not been able to maintain my speed uphill quite as well as I normally would in the past. It's another very inconveniently placed stop sign here. Not quite so bad, of course, because now I'm turning and heading west on 110th Street. This is another nice wide shoulder, and this is a little bit better pavement than Xerxes. It's a lot more fun going the other direction though, because the hills are in a more favorable position. To the left is one of many golf courses in the area. Looks like the elevation profile down at the bottom of the screen is a little bit out of sync. I feel like I ought to be able to carry the speed on these little rollers a little bit better than I am right now. Currently I have, I think, maybe a 1.3 inch Continental contact speed in the rear of the Velomobile, and then the front is a set of Continental Grand Prix. I think they're maybe 28 millimeter. I would ideally ride just a little bit wider tire in the back. It's just a little bit safer if the rear tire were to blow. But the front of the Velomobile has pretty low clearance, and I ended up making the front wheel wells just a little bit taller than ideally I would have. And that does give me some problems with clearance. Eventually, I'll get some Continental contact Urbans in the front in a little bit wider profile, but those are currently unavailable in the United States, and present shipping prices from Europe are really expensive. The stop sign that we were at just a moment ago, that's France Avenue, and before I turned off for the detour down Xerxes, that's where we were before, so we've finally got back to going a little bit more west. And as we pass down here on 110th through another residential zone, we're going to eventually arrive at Normandale Boulevard, and then we'll take that a little bit south and then curve along the river bluffs on my favorite stretch of road. The pavement here again is a little bit rougher than I would prefer, but unfortunately roads wear out faster when you have to deal with a lot of weather, winter weather, and we end up salting our roads fairly heavily in Minnesota. The salters sand them, and road plows trying to clear off roads in the winter. All of that really is hard on the surface of the pavement, and that coupled with a lot of traffic just really wears our roads out quickly. In fact, very few roads in the area have been recently repaved, unfortunately, so can get some pretty rough riding. Garbage pickup in this area is, you don't have a selection of who your garbage hauler will be. It's just each section of the city has a dedicated company that takes care of the trash, and then there's one day per week in each of these sections of the city where it's trash pickup. And obviously in this area, Monday is trash day. Theoretically, I think they're supposed to put the trash cans on the edge of the driveway, not in front of the curb like they are, but fortunately traffic this time of day is pretty light on this stretch of road, so if I have to dodge around some trash cans, I am not likely to get run into. Rest assured, I did look both ways before pulling out into the lane here. And this here is Normandale Boulevard, which also has a fairly wide shoulder designated as a bike lane. This is by far my favorite stretch of road to ride on, and I couldn't tell you how many times I've biked along this stretch of road. Bloomington doesn't have anywhere near the dedicated bike lanes that a lot of other communities have. For instance, to the west of us is Eden Prairie, which has a really extensive network of paved trails. Most of them are in pretty rough shape and were probably first paved in maybe the 80s or the 90s or something. Bloomington is like some of the other communities in the area. For instance, Edina to the north and Richfield to the east of us has really been making an effort to increase the cycling infrastructure. And while Bloomington hasn't necessarily created a lot of new bike trails, they have at least made an effort to create some on-road bike lanes. And for velomobile riding, that's actually quite ideal. There's not problems with trying to clear crossings. You don't have to worry so much about encountering pedestrians. As we head up to this corner here, we're getting up to the very edge of the bluffs along the Minnesota River. This is a nice set of small undulating hills. And around the corner here is a nice stretch, a little bit of an uphill, and then you get a nice downhill from there. The display here says this is 0% grade, but there's actually just a little bit of a slight uphill in this area. I think it's just not quite enough to register as a full percent of gradient. The houses on the left of me, especially coming up in this next section, are some fairly large houses. This is kind of the ritzy area of Bloomington. the right is the Minnesota Valley Country Club, yet another of several golf courses in the area. It's also a very popular place for weddings on weekends. The bridge that's coming up crosses a rail line that runs north to south, runs past Normandale Lake, which is another spot where I often go cycling, though not with the Velomobile, but it also runs all the way down to the river. And if the rail line is ever abandoned, I'm hoping that a group will get together to acquire the rights to it and turn it into a cycling route, because it would be a really, really good connector route to take you from the river valley all the way up into Minneapolis. To the right here is Bethany College. Fairly small school, not a particularly large campus, but they do have a very nice scenic area. I debated here whether to continue going straight or to do a left turn here, and I ended up opting to go ahead and do a left. This road, there's a turnoff just a little bit around the corner that will take you down to the river, and there's a pedestrian bridge across near the area of the former Bloomington ferry that will take you down to a path that runs along the south side of the Minnesota River and will take you into Shakopee. Unfortunately, the last time I was down there, there was a tree down across the path that appears to have been down for a while, and it was a bit of a challenge to get the Velomobile around it. Once I did get around it, I found out that they had added a new culvert, and the new culvert, the angle is steep enough that my Velomobile nose bottoms out and I got stuck, and I had to get out and move the Velomobile around and then pull it up backwards to get up the other side. The turnoff is that road right there on the left, and I don't know why they didn't just make it straight across the top of the culvert, but it's basically made that area of trail undesirable for a place to ride. It's just enough of an uphill gradient here to get me slowed down quite a bit. I think that cyclist there was the first one I've seen the entire ride. Here straight ahead are the Dred Scott playing fields. There's this bunch of baseball fields, some tennis courts, mini golf, batting cages, some football fields. They can be pretty busy on the weekends in the summer. But I'm gonna just pull in here for a quick little rest stop. While I was stopped here, I encountered a lady out, I think pushing her kid in a stroller, who was pretty impressed with the Velomobile and really wanted to see me ride it, so I tried to give her an exciting showing here of a grand 8 miles an hour. Waiting here for a little bit of traffic to clear. Part of the reason that I took the loop around was there's a nice downhill stretch here on the way back. It's not a very steep downhill gradient, but it's just enough to get a good bit of speed going. I think it was in through here that I hit my top speed for the day, which wasn't honestly all that fast. Some folks in, say, something like a Milan can probably average about 30 miles an hour. They're also riding a Velomobile that's about 30 pounds lighter, so they have an advantage of not having to push quite as much weight in the vehicle when they're going uphill, and also, of course, accelerating from a stop. And that does make a difference. I can get a little bit more speed probably going downhill because I've got the extra weight to build up a little bit more momentum. That road was the turnoff that I was on just a bit ago. From here on back, it's just a reverse of the route that I rode before, and I don't know that I have anything else really exciting to add about the ride itself. I'm still finishing up some bits and pieces on the Velomobile build. For instance, I'm working on enclosing the chain line, getting a derailleur cover on the back, and of course with the build of the Milan, there's not actually a wheel cover in the back. Normally in the Milan, the wheel is just open within the tail because the tail is removable, and you've got a rear bulkhead where the suspension is attached, because I did go ahead and put suspension on the back. And a lot of dirt and grime just ends up getting thrown around all over in that tail. So I'm working on coming up with an idea to create a rear wheel well to try to cut down on the amount of stuff that's going to get thrown around in there in the winter. The one concern, of course, would be that snow could build up in there were I to ride in the snow at some point in time, and that could, of course, kind of clog things up and the wheel could get stuck. I don't know that I will be planning on riding when there's snow all over the ground, but it kind of depends on just how bored I get riding indoors over the course of the winter. Aside from that, I may build a second race hood that will be more similar to the traditional wah race hood. I do like the idea of having kind of the skirt area around the manhole and being able to remove the hood itself. Presently, I have more of a style of hood like you would see on a DF or some of the newer designs from Velomobile.nl. Aside from that, I think pretty much everything else is finished. I've made a more finalized seat mount system. I had just been mounting the front seat to some wood blocks that were screwed into a reinforced area of the wheel well, and I've replaced those now with an aluminum bracket that I'm using instead. And I'm still working on kind of tweaking some things with the rear derailleur. I have a SRAM GX, it's like the 210 or the 10.2 or something like that, which is notorious for problems with the B-screw stripping, and that's been causing a lot of problems with the derailleur not being able to get over to the largest chainring. I've got to really tweak that B-screw just right, because theoretically I'm just a little bit beyond the capacity for the rear derailleur, since I run 40 tooth and 11 42 tooth chainring in the back, cassette in the rear, and then the front chainring is a triple 30 42 52 or 30 39 52, I forget which, and that is a little bit beyond the spec chain wrap capacity. Some people talk about having problems keeping their front chainring well adjusted. I haven't had any issues with that. I'm using a grip shift, a twist shift for the triple in the front, and rather than having indexed, you've got enough adjustment with that I don't have any problems with the front shifting. It is, of course, very dark in the front, in the nose of the chain, inside the nose, so it's really hard to see whether you're in the small, middle, or the large chainring when you're riding. So sometimes I have to kind of guess, and with things being as noisy as they are, you can't always tell if you've got a little bit of chain rub either up front either. So I maybe need to mount a light up front or something so that I can see what's going on. I do have one other wiring thing that I need to add, and that is to wire in a small fan or two, a couple of computer fans, just to get a little better air circulation, because it does get really hot and steamy, especially in the warmer months. Typically, I don't take the Velomobile out unless it's about 75 degrees Fahrenheit or cooler. Anything warmer than that seems like good biking weather, and as fun as it is to get the kind of fast speeds that you can get in a Velomobile, I do still very much enjoy riding just a traditional bike, or even taking the trike out for a spin. If you haven't checked out any of my other videos about the Velomobile, there's a couple of videos giving a little bit of a tour of the lighting setup that I have, and also giving some more close-up interior views, exterior views, probably talking a little bit more about the specs that I set the Velomobile up with. And once I finish enclosing the rear wheel well and have a chance to kind of test that and make sure that everything's working well with my plan for that, then I'll do a video about that. At the moment, the rear wheel well is just made out of some Coroplast sheets that I had sitting around from when I made a Velomobile fairing for my IM Trice T trike. It was a nice idea, but the wheels are so much further apart in the front of a trice. This wasn't the Q&T, this was just the standard T, and I think the wheelbase was something like 31 or 32 inches, and by the time you get a fairing around that, you're just pushing way too much air, and there were times going downhill that it actually felt like the surface area of the Velomobile was holding me back from going faster. I could feel that the bike wanted to go quicker, but it just wasn't physically possible. Whereas with this walk clone, you feel like you just cut through the air, and it almost feels more like the rolling resistance of the tires is what holds me back sometimes, which is why I'd like to do another roll down test. I did one sometime this summer, and I didn't do all that much riding after it, but I forgot after the first couple of rides to double check and make sure that the screws were still nice and tight that set the spacing up in the front, and it's possible that some things have shifted a little bit and that it's not quite in that ideal spot anymore. Aside from that, I would say that the build is completed, and I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Is the shell precisely the same on both the left and right sides? Is it really truly symmetrical? Not really. How much of a difference that's making in how aerodynamic I am and how I drive, I'm not really sure. It would be interesting to find somebody with a wind tunnel to do some testing on it, but I don't have access to anything like that, so I can just base it off of how it drives, and I don't have any problems with any sort of handling or anything like that. So even though it's probably not, well, I know it's not perfectly symmetrical, it does handle very well. The only time that I would say I have any sort of issue with handling is if I'm up above around maybe 35 miles an hour going downhill and I'm still trying to pedal with just the 52 tooth chainring in the front and 11 tooth in the rear. At that point in time, because you're spinning at such a high RPM, it can make things feel just a little bit squirrely. Putting a larger chainring in the front, of course, would help a lot with that, because then you're pedaling at a much lower RPM, and you don't get quite so much kind of pedal steer when you're at a lower cadence. I'm not sure I want to deal with the shifting issues and the issue with chain wrap that would come from switching to a larger chainring. I'm not looking for massive speed records or anything like that. I'd be much happier with building up my fitness and being able to just ride on the flats at a little bit higher speed. Right now, on flatter routes, I ride more around 18 or so miles an hour, and compared to the 15 that I would often average on a standard bike, that is obviously a speed gain, but I would like to get a little bit more accustomed to pushing 85 pounds of bicycle down the road rather than worrying about how fast I can go pedaling downhill. We're turning here back onto Xerxes. Which means that the portion of the ride that avoids stop signs is unfortunately coming to a conclusion. This really is probably the longest stretch of road you can find in Bloomington where you don't encounter stop signs and stoplights and a lot of traffic. If you get into the area around Eden Prairie just to the west, you can get a lot longer stretches of road and even connect some longer stretches of road up that avoid running into so many stop signs and stoplights. But it really is a challenge in the cities to get long stretches where you can start to build up your momentum. Since taking this bit of video, I took the Velomobile on a circuit around Minneapolis for a ride using primarily trails. The roads in that area are not really low enough traffic that I'd want to ride there. But I actually found that I was a couple mile an hour slower riding there despite the lack of elevation gain, just because there's so many crosswalks, there's a lot of stop signs even along the trails, and you just are always having to slow down and then speed up and slow down and speed up. You encounter a little bit more cycle traffic, and when you're always having to regain momentum, it just kind of takes the fun out of it. So as scenic as that area is, I found myself doing most of my riding just around Bloomington and Eden Prairie since moving to this area. Prior to this, I lived a little bit further out to the west in one of the outer rings of the suburbs. And out there, you're a little bit closer to farm country, and while it's a little bit hillier in that area, I think it would be a more enjoyable place to ride Velomobile just because there's not so many stop signs and stoplights, there's a little bit less traffic, there's not so much cycle traffic. Even here in Bloomington during the summer, you can encounter quite a few people that are out riding, and some of them the last couple of years I will often find riding against traffic in the cycle lane, and then you've got to figure out, well, are they going to go to the right, are they going to go to the left, are they going to not move? And you've got to watch behind you as well for traffic, because chances are you're going to have to pull out on the road to get around them. And oftentimes it's in areas where there's actually dedicated separate cycle paths, and I'm not sure why people that are concerned about riding near traffic would ride on the road when they've got a separated cycle path. I've even encountered pedestrians walking in the dedicated cycle lanes, even though there's a sidewalk right next to it, and they're walking against traffic. And that does make it just a little bit more dangerous to get out and cycle, because again, you never know which way are they going to go. Are they going to change their mind at the last minute? Getting here towards the end of the route, I think I've included all the thoughts that I can about my first few experiences riding Velomobile. It is a very fun experience. I feel a lot more confident riding quickly in a Velomobile compared to what I would feel in a bicycle, especially once I've got the race hood on. the stability of having 3 wheels versus 2. You don't have to worry about unclipping when you come to a stop sign, or if you hit some loose debris, about the tire slipping in the rear and the bike tipping over, or having to come to a quick stop and not being able to get your feet unclipped in time. Of course, those advantages are all present on the trike too, which I'm sure is why recumbent trikes have become so much more popular in the past few years. But of course, with a Velomobile, you're going to get quite a bit more speed, and typically I average 3 or 4 miles an hour quicker in the Velomobile right now. As I continue to fine-tune the drivetrain and get more accustomed with the handling, I expect that I'll pick up a couple more miles an hour. It would be interesting to try out a lighter Velomobile at some point in time. It would be fun to test drive a Milan or even a DF over a similar kind of course, just to compare what the difference is in speed between a commercially built Velomobile and my home build. The process of building the Velomobile, besides the fact that it took up most of my family room for about 6 months, there were portions of it that were kind of fun. I enjoyed working with the cedar strips and kind of building up the shell itself, but it's the interior parts and working with fiberglass that I found really took the longest, especially since there's not really dedicated instructions on how to install the steering and how to mount the rear suspension, how to keep things trued up and that kind of thing. I did get a lot of really great information and help from Katanga and Stefan and his team, where I purchased the parts, and he was gracious enough to answer a lot of the questions that I had as far as setting up the steering and mounting the rear suspension. And of course, there's a great resource of information on the Bent Rider forums. A lot of Velomobile riders there were great about offering information, and especially Terry from Canada, who also has built a wood cedar walk load. A few months before I built mine, he's actually built a couple of cedar strip Velomobiles, and he was able to give me a considerable amount of information to help with the build. But again, it would be fun sometime to compare the ride in mine to a commercially made one, and in the end, the build ended up costing not much less than what it would have cost to buy someone's used Velomobile. Something like a Quest XS would probably be about the perfect size for me. I'm not especially tall or particularly wide, so it would be easy to fit into something like the XS or even something like a Snook, but I think the clearance on a Snook would be a problem for where I ride. There's just too many curbs that are just steep enough that it's hard to clear. Especially in the front of mine, I have problems. Even the curb on my driveway, I've bottomed out several times, and I actually ended up building a couple of different noses to try to get one that would give me enough clearance to just plain get out of the driveway without having to pick up the front end of the Velomobile. Because of the design of the boom in the front, that front end is pretty heavy. I think the boom itself is something ridiculous, like 8 or 10 pounds or something. And I'm sure that with a better selection of aluminum maybe even a little bit different design, that I could get a boom up front that was a couple pounds lighter. And there's, I'm sure, several things that I could optimize inside the Velomobile. For instance, a little bit smaller wheel well in the back, and a little more less generous use of fillet along the joints between, you know, the wheel wells and the shell and stuff like that. That it would have allowed me to trim down a few pounds of weight, but in the end, it doesn't matter if it's 80 pounds or 85 pounds. At that weight, I think it really doesn't matter. I certainly wouldn't be able to get it down 30 pounds to weigh something like, you know, the weight of an Alpha 7 or even a DF or even some of the new Milans like the Mark 7. So for what it is, it's heavy, but it's a good opportunity to get a feel for what it's like to ride Velomobile. It's good protection in the cooler weather that we come in contact with here in Minnesota. There's really, for comfortable outside riding, you're really looking at most years April through the end of October, and then the rest of the time it's just too freezing cold, especially on a recumbent, to go out riding when you've got your feet sitting up there in the air, and I don't have quite as good of blood circulation into my extremities, so I get cold pretty quickly even with thick socks and warm shoes on. So for me, having a Velomobile will extend the riding season, you know, maybe into December or so, and might be able to get out maybe a little earlier in the year, and you know, maybe I'm able to start riding in February or March or something. Of course, with climate change, the weather can be a little bit more extreme, but also our winters the last couple of years have been a little bit shorter. So, you know, I might be able to get out riding 10 months of the year instead of 6 months. For me, I think that's worth it. This little road here, it's kind of my little hack to get back near my house. It's the flattest road heading north in this area. France has a little bit of a hill, and if I went along the 9 Mile Creek Road, all of the roads that get from that back to where I live all have a little bit of an uphill. But cutting through this neighborhood and then a little bit of stretch of the trail along France gives me a relatively flat way back to the house. Also the advantage, of course, of not having to ride next to the traffic on France Avenue. So even though it's pretty noisy inside the Velomobile, at least it's not traffic noise, it's just the soothing sound of the chain jiggling back and forth in the chain tunnel. The one downside with this little flat bypass is that I'm about to turn left against a do not enter sign, and yes, I can read that says do not enter, but if I try to go around the right way, the angle is just a little bit too much for the turning circle of the Velomobile, and I would have to get out and physically turn the Velomobile. So I just check for traffic, and I think maybe once I've encountered a car coming there, and so I stop and let them go, and then just make my turn. This little bit of road is just a little bit uphill, so it will slow me down just a hair. And that's okay because there's a stop sign coming up here soon anyway. And with that, I bring you to the end of my ride. Thanks for coming along, and leave a comment in this section if you have any further questions about the Velomobile or ideas for things that I can do for videos in the future.